So I just want to go into something a little bit different, but definitely something that's relevant to my podcast because we talk about it a lot here, which is Austrian economics. And you're definitely someone who has been a big proponent of that, especially in politics where there's not that many people. And you've got a great speech, kind of lecture on YouTube, which is titled "An Introduction to Austrian Economics," which is on I think it's the Oxford University Mises page. And I'm interested to know, what was your introduction to Austrian economics? Like, where did you hear about it or get into it? What was your kind of moment of realization that this was a superior system to this kind of Keynesian system, which most people seem to be under the spell of?
I was always hostile to Keynesianism. Um, how I came to the Austrian school, it was very small steps, salami slices, really. Because when you're managing money in the city, and I've been managing money in some format now for 40 years. I joined the city in the late 1960s, got my professional exams, and worked my way up the system, as it were. And so that's what I actually did, and I gradually came to realize that the economic system that we had was flawed, because it wasn't socialism or capitalism, it was mercantilism. And of course, an old geezer like me knows the label. We have at the moment mercantilism. We don't have capitalism. It's sort of called crony capitalism, which is a sort of a loose way of describing mercantilism, but it's not capitalism. It's corporatism. And it's the sort of thing that we had perhaps in the 19th century to a certain extent, the East India Company, so on and so forth, and the Hudson Bay Company, and that kind of thing. So I came to it very slowly, and then I joined the Mises Institute, where I was called. I went over there to lecture and do all sorts of stuff, and met other people who were like-minded. You do tend, when you have a belief system of this kind of economic system, you tend to feel that you're the only person in the world that has it. So it was really nice to meet other people who were enlightened, as it were, in this particular thing. And if I'm ever asked, as I sometimes am, to explain it in one sentence, I always say the Austrian school we want nothing to do with government. I don't want to give the government anything, and I want nothing from the government. I just want to be left alone. And fun enough, when I was on the stump getting elected the first time, I think it was during the smoking ban or something, but yet another rule and regulation by a member of the idiot English middle class. And I was parking the car in Leeds Airport, and there was a car park attendant came up to, and he recognised me because I'd done some TV by that stage. And he said, Mr. Bloom, recognise it. And this is an ordinary working Joe in Leeds, a car park attendant. And he said, Mr. Bloom, why can't they just leave us alone? And that sums up, that was a working man. Most people just want to be left alone. They don't want all these rules and regulations. And of course, it's got worse and worse and worse and worse. And it hasn't stopped. Since 2016, when we won the Brexit referendum. It was supposed to stop. We haven't rescinded any, and we're still adding new ones. So it's just got worse and worse and worse. But of course it would do, wouldn't it? Because we have a World Economic Forum government, IMF, WHO, so on and so forth. So we are not our own masters. So that's where we are, as I see it, at the moment.
So this is a good time actually to bring in one of the clips which I mentioned I was going to bring in, which is a really fantastic speech that you did about, I believe the name of the clip on YouTube might be "The Working Day of an Average Englishman." And
I remember
you kind of
that
went
speech,
through,
yeah.
and you went through the whole from kind of morning to evening of the average Englishman and the amount they have to pay in taxes. So I'll play that out now for the listeners.
Now, on behalf of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy, for 2 minutes, Mr. Bloom.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wonder if you'll permit me to gallop through the working day of the average Englishman. He wakes up and he turns on his taxed telly to get the news. He leaves his heavily taxed house, gets in his heavily taxed car. He fills it with heavily taxed diesel. He gets to work to earn an income which, after income tax, employer and employee national insurance, a third of his income has disappeared. A third. He drives home and stops on the high street for a few articles for the house. His purchases are taxed at 20%. He calls in for a pint, over 2/3 of the cost of which goes in tax. He dreams of a family holiday abroad, but he can't afford the airport tax. He longs for the day that he can retire, but the politicians won't let him go. We must steal his savings, mustn't we? The financial transaction tax. The poor sap doesn't even know we've nicked it. Of course, with the Commission, top salaries income tax free, non-contributory pension schemes, it's difficult for you, isn't it, to imagine his distress? Because you're not in this game, are you? You're not in this game. You don't pay any of this. You don't pay any of this. On a more technical note, perhaps I can pick up, Mr. President, I draw the House's attention to my own lunatic committee's Amendment 39 to Article 4B. The withdrawal of legal title to untaxed transactions anywhere in the world. Sugar in the petrol tank, if you will. We're very much looking forward to the vote. We're watching to see which imbeciles commend it. I suspect it will be the same usual parliamentarian flat earthers.
So, listening back to that clip and just kind of reflecting on what you were saying there, obviously, like you just said, you are someone who believes that government should leave the individual alone and the individual should ask nothing of the government. And I generally agree with that take. Where do you think that Britain is now? Because it seems to me that we've come so far from that ideology. We are just nowhere even close to that now. I mean, we have this kind of supposedly left-right politics, but even the right, even the Conservatives, they are not purveyors of small government by any means. So where do you see Britain, and also, I guess, looking at that in a global context as well? Are we typical, or do you think that other nations now have kind of taken on the mantle of true kind of libertarian ideas, and that Britain is kind of being left behind?
I don't know of any libertarian countries at all, to be honest. I think the nearest thing post-war certainly was John Cooperthwaite's Hong Kong, and that was as close to it comes. I don't know of any now. I believe that we have what is in point of fact a fascist state in this country and Europe and increasingly in North America. Now, I don't use fascism in the pejorative sense of the National Union of Students moron that shouts it, not knowing what it is. It is a rather unholy alliance between state, banks and corporations. And I would suggest that that's exactly what we have now with the globalist agenda, so on and so forth. I mean, it is fascism, and fascism was very popular in the 1920s, in Italy, of course, where it started, and to an extent, Germany. It's very popular. They seem to like it in Europe. Europeans like this kind of government. They're comfortable with this kind of government. And of course, the British, up until probably the last generation, are for the freedom of the individual. And I think the great strength of Britain was believing in the independence of the individual. And of course, who led the field in that, actually, but of course the Great Enlightenment in Scotland. And we see on the 1st of April with this extraordinary legislation coming in with hate crimes and secret phone calls to the police and all this kind of thing. I mean, Voltaire actually explained how wonderful he thought the Enlightenment was, and actually came to Britain to live because he was free. You got freedom of speech. You had a free press. Who on earth would suggest now that we have a free press? Who on earth now would suggest we have freedom of speech? And of course, we have a generation, my nephews, as it were, or my great nephews in point of fact, now I get older, are beginning to believe that that's the norm. They're beginning to believe that that's the normal way of living, that there's a little man in Whitehall who issues regulations, that the principles of English law, which have now been virtually abandoned, they're not being taught in schools. The standard of education is appallingly bad. I lectured at universities, many universities. I'm banned from some of them. I'm now banned from Cambridge when I wanted to give a lecture on the government of Lord Salisbury, which was obviously too hot to handle for Cambridge undergraduates. All this kind of thing is. I actually was also booked to speak at Stirling University on the potential benefits under the Austrian School of Economics to Scotland if they adopted Austrian school economics. I was banned. I was banned from that as well. So we do not have freedom of speech under any circumstances. We don't have freedom of the press, and they are and the principles of English law were the pillars on which built the greatest empire the world's ever seen, for better or for worse. And we could argue about that another day. But we built a great nation on that basis, and it was based on basically the freedom of the individual. We don't have that now, and we have a generation that don't even expect it.
As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research based, and I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I'll automatically share it with you. So, surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.